Folks, John Wilson here from SOAR, and so delighted to have two of my favorite people joining us as guests on our webinar. They run a company called ImpactADHD, and Elaine Taylor and Dianne Dempster or Elaine Taylor-Klaus and Dianne Dempster are individuals that I've met years and years ago. We were on the conference circuit together, and over that course of time, we have become colleagues, and then even more so, we have become very dear friends. They are, if I go to Atlanta, I'm having a meal at one of their homes. Thank you again. Their message, they're famous for something called Sanity School, and their message is so on point and very much in line with who we are and what we believe. And so the last thing I want to say before I turn it over to them is that you asked for this specific title. We reached out to families, and you said, "Hey, can you do something on stress management?" And so I said, "I know two ladies that can really help us pull this off." I also want to remind you that next month we're starting a whole new webinar series on SOAR's Behavior Management Guide for Families, and so tune in each Tuesday of September, and we'll tackle each one, and we'll have some fun with that. But without further ado, my dear friends Elaine and Dianne, the Zoom platform is yours.
Thank you. It is so good to be here. We are truly huge fans of SOAR's. I'm such a huge fan. I even sent my daughter to work with you one summer, and that's true confidence. So we're thrilled to be here, and we're thrilled to be tackling this conversation. A lot of the time in the last couple of months, we've been talking about raising complex kids in complex times and behavior management and all of that stuff. So it's kind of fun for us to step outside of that realm and go back to where I think our roots really are, which is talking about stress and parenting, and how do we manage ourselves so that we can do the best job we can raising our complex kids.
Well, and so, it's two parts of this. It's like part of it is our own stress as a parent, because it's really stressful managing these kids, but also these kids are going through a lot of stress, and that may be part of what you're struggling with is your child's stress. So we'll talk a little bit about both, some of the signals and opportunities here, and particularly in this time right now, I think we're all running around on a little bit of low-level stress constantly, and so a lot of what we're talking about applies in a very, very different way right now.
Yeah. So actually, I'm looking at, we did pull together some slides to kind of guide us in our conversation today, and I'll pull that up in a minute. But Dianne, let's start by introducing ourselves, because that's not in the slides today. So you want to get started?
Great. So we are the co-founders of ImpactADHD, and both of us are moms of complex kids. Both of us are coaches. And we really started this organization as a way to help identify a gap in supporting the ADHD community, which was really helping parents. And our stories are really different. I was one of those kind of type A, get it done corporate moms that was managing everybody in my family and being frustrated and yelling a lot more than I wanted to. And when I became a coach, I became more of the kind of parent my kids needed to be successful and to become increasingly more independent. And Elaine had a really similar story, but different.
But also really different, yeah. So I'm the mom in what I used to call an ADHD plus family of 5. So lots of complex issues in our family, a lot of ADHD, anxiety, learning disabilities. But I didn't know that early on. So when I was in the mom of 3 kids under the age of 10, all I knew was that I was lost, I was overwhelmed, and I didn't know what I needed to do to help my kids. But I knew that something needed to happen, because I was following all the advice of the experts, and it wasn't really working. And I kept doing what they told me to do, and it would help some, but not enough. And there was just something, there was a gap, there was something missing. And so kind of like dominoes, as my kids kept getting diagnosed, I eventually looked around and thought, well, I wonder if this could all be coming from my husband. Maybe there's a reason I'm so lost and overwhelmed. And so I finally had myself evaluated. I was trying to go back to graduate school. And it turned out that I had had undiagnosed learning and attention issues myself, and anxiety. And that kind of explained a lot. All of a sudden, my life made sense. And as I began to get into coaching as a way to support myself, as Dianne said, I discovered this whole way of communicating with my kids that was different and profoundly more effective than everything I had done up until that point. And so when Dianne and I met each other, we discovered that this was actually not rocket science. It was something we could teach. And we decided we were just going to do a webinar. In those days, or actually those days, it was before webinars. We were going to do a workshop. Right. That's where we started. And, you know, within a year, we were an innovative program with Chad, and we had a global online support resource for parents. And so we've been doing this together almost 10 years. And really, we are all about creating an environment for parents to learn what you need to learn to pay attention to yourself, so you can really empower your kids to reach their potential. And the change that your kids need starts with you.
And one of the questions, Elaine, before we transition, one more thing. Yep. One of the questions we get all the time is, okay, so wait, what age kids are you talking about? And what kinds of kids are you talking about? We use the term complex kids. So these are kids that don't quite fit the mold, whether it's on the spectrum, whether it's ADHD, anxiety, dyslexia, learning differences, all those sorts of things. The methodologies and the approach we teach is applicable. And then we talk about kids from age 4 to, I've got now a client who's got an adult kid that we're working through.
I was going to say 34, I believe, 34, is the most recent. Yeah.
It used to be 24, now it's 34. But it's the methodology, again, that we teach, and the approach that we teach, this coach approach we'll talk more about, is really applicable whether your kid is 4 or whether your kid is 17 or whether your kid is an adult.
Yeah. So I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to start talking about how to reduce stress for you and your child. And see if I got this right. Did I get it?
Yep, you got it.
Awesome.
Well, and we want to start by asking the people in the chat. I know there's a few people here live. What are some of the things that stress you out? You know, is it conflict with your kids? Is it organization and logistics? Is it just life in general? Is it
the yelling and the screaming?
Yelling and screaming, those sorts of things.
Kids not listening to you, kids not responding the way you'd like them to respond, right? So what are the things that stress you out? I can't see the chat die, so I'm relying on you.
Conflict with kids. I see conflict with kids and COVID, conflict and chaos. If I say, take your plates to the sink one more time, I will implode. Thank you, Evelyn. Totally relate. Totally relate. My son's not doing his schoolwork.
Right.
Screaming, not doing what's good for her. Great, great. Lots of things. And I think that the piece that I want to pull out of this is that everybody's things are a little bit different, right? It's that you may not have a kid that's struggling with homework. You might have a kid who is handling the plates in the sink really well. You may or may not be in conflict, but stress is a normal reaction for a triggering event. So it's not like certain things cause stress in one person and certain things in another. Elaine, can I tell a story on you?
Yeah.
So I remember
better than anyone I know, Dianne.
No, I don't know if you know this one. So I remember really distinctly when the first time I ever took a plane ride with Elaine Taylor-Klaus, and we were sitting next to each other, and the plane was getting ready to take off, and we're sitting there, and I look over at her, and she's like holding on to the grip in the seats, and she goes, "I hate this moment." And I said, "I love this moment." And it was this sort of aha that stress can be completely different for different people. And so I just want to start with that kind of foundation. It's normal. Everybody goes through it. And how our body reacts to it is identical, whether it's a little stressor or a big stressor.
Well, and whether it's what we would call a positive stress or a negative stress, right? So there is such thing as good stress. So you're getting excited for a celebration or a graduation or something happening that you feel great about. Even if you're excited, that can still create stress in your body. So stress and anxiety, excitement and anxiety are kind of opposite sides of the same coin, really, in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And, well, go ahead.
No.
Well, and I was going to say, and the catch is that the brain can't make that distinction, right? So if you think of it as kind of like a fork in a tree, if you're coming upon stress, the brain doesn't distinguish whether it's good stress or bad stress, whether it's physical threat, whether there's a, a guy with a gun, or I like to use the saber-toothed tiger at the cave door, right? Or whether you're worried about something or concerned about something or scared. Or
it's kind of a little switch that goes on or off. It's like your body says, am I in alert? Am I in emergency? Or am I okay? Am I safe or am I threatened? And those are kind of the only two. It's literally an on-off switch. And so it's the same if your kid is late with his homework, or like you said, the saber-toothed tiger is chasing you. Both of them, your body actually responds in the same exact way.
Well, and I'm looking at this picture of the woman at the desk with piles and piles of papers, right? And that feeling of just too much and overwhelm, and I can't get on top of it. That's going to have the same physiological stress impact on your body as if you slam on the brakes because somebody's cut you off.
Well,
right?
And if you think about it, most of us, it's like, okay, if you're almost in a car accident, that lasts for what, about 5 seconds, and then it's done. So you have this sort of emergency sort of thing happen, and then it's done. But the deadlines and the late and the stress over the conflict in the house, that stuff doesn't change. And so you're in this kind of constant state of alarm and stress because the triggers are happening literally every day. And I'm looking at the triggers you guys said. It's like my kid not doing his homework. That isn't something that just happens one time. I'm guessing that's something you struggle with 5 to 7 days a week.
Right. And multiple times in the day that you're aware of it. So you're not just all of a sudden aware of it once and then it goes away. It's like every time, I know for me, every time I walk upstairs into the kitchen, I'm reminded of something else that has to get done, that needs to get done, that hasn't gotten done, that someone said they were going to do, but didn't do that, right? Like all of those things, it keeps coming. And how I choose to interpret it, to think about it, and we'll get to that in a few minutes, has a huge impact on how I let or don't let that stress impact me long term. So let's switch to.
Yeah, so for those of us with executive function challenges, or those of you who have kids with executive function challenges, the reality is that stress reaction is actually amplified. Because, and I guess I'm going to say it the other way around. If you have a kid with executive function challenges and they're triggered or stressed, those executive function challenges will be amplified. So those of us right now in a situation where we're in the middle of a pandemic, if we're already forgetful or have a hard time getting started or struggling with anxiety, it's going to be even more challenging in a time when our stress levels are high.
Well, and so I'm going to step back and say, okay, so what's executive function challenges, right? Because we sort of made a leap there. And so what we're saying is when the brain is triggered, when there's a stress incident that happens. So let's go back and say, okay, so how does the brain function? The frontal lobe, the prefrontal cortex of our brain is that part of our brain where we think and feel and plan and act, right? That's kind of what makes us human. And the primitive brain, we often call it the amygdala hijack, is when we get stressed, the primitive brain takes over. The problem is that when the primitive brain takes over, we're not operating from that part of our brain that can think and plan and reason and self-regulate. Right? Collaborate, any of those things. We're coming from a place of trigger. And when we're triggered, as the executive function shuts down, or our access to use that frontal lobe is diminished.
Our choices are fight or flight or freeze, if that may be what flight looks like for you.
Right. Hang on, I'm working on getting the button. So what we want to talk about today, and maybe let's check in with in the chat and sort of, are there questions before we move into a process that you can use to escape this threat cycle? Do you kind of understand essentially what's going on in terms of the trigger brain? You got a frontal lobe, you got the amygdala hijack, you got a stress situation, and boom, you're no longer operating from here. Does that resonate for people? Is it making sense?
Yeah, and I want to take this a step further while we're waiting for people to give us a thumbs up, is that if you've got a child who's having a challenging behavior, especially if it's a little bit out of the ordinary right now, even if it's not, chances are it's because of an executive function challenge and a stress. So if you were looking at your child and they're having a hard time remembering things, or a hard time sitting still, or a hard time, following through and getting things done, there's some component of that is because of stress. Even if they,
wait, there's some component that's because of executive function.
Yes.
Right. And then when you can't get yourself to do what you think you're supposed to do, that's going to create stress when they can't get themselves to do. Is that fair to make that distinction?
Yeah.
So there's this, they're inextricably linked, and we can't really separate them. And so we need to understand that if we're trying to manage stress, we need to sort of get back to that part of the brain where we're operating from our most effective brain, where the brain is working most smoothly. Right?
Well, and I think the other piece of it is to know that, again, it's this sort of, you may have a triggered child in front of you and you don't even recognize it. They may not look stressed. They may just be irritable. They may be sassy or snarky or whatever else. And it could be a real signal that what's going on underneath it for them, even if they say, I don't care, mom, it really could be a stressed out kid.
It's funny. I've been doing some work with a program doing some training for myself in positive intelligence. And one of the exercises they had us do was to go back and look at pictures of us as little kids. And what I noticed was how early my stress started, how early my anxiety was visible in my face as a child. At 2, it wasn't there. By 4, it was already there. And I think we sometimes get so accustomed to seeing it in our kids that we don't even realize the level of that kind of low level stress that they're often going through the world with. Because if they can't get themselves to do what's expected of them, it's going to stress them out on some level, right? So anything we want to check in on in the chat before we move on?
I think everybody's given us a thumbs up that we can keep going. So
Awesome.
What we want to teach you is a process to use, whether it's you that's stressed out and triggered, or your kid that's stressed out and triggered, that you can use when this happen. And we use those words kind of interchangeably, because the reality is you may be in a full-on trigger and something happened and you're just off the handle, or you're maybe just a little bit elevated and stressed out. Either way, your body is reacting instead of responding. And what you really want to do is get back in your frontal lobe, as Elaine was saying before. Reclaim your brain is the language we use, so that you can be your creative, collaborative, problem-solving person instead of this reactive, freaking out parent, which a lot of us end up being.
Or same for our kids, right? So step 1 to tackle any kind of a trigger or stress situation, and we call it the threat cycle, the stress cycle. This is, the 4 steps to escape the stress cycle. Step 1 is to notice, is to recognize that you're stressed in the first place. And we often skip this step. I'm thinking about my son when he was little, and I would try to slow things down when he'd get triggered and say, well, take some deep breaths or whatever. And he would do, okay, I'm okay now, right? And so he wasn't taking the time to really acknowledge that he was stressed out in the first place, right? And we can have a whole other conversation about how I didn't handle that well and how I would have handled it better differently as he got older. But that capacity to be able to stop and recognize, to notice, to become aware of, oh, I'm feeling stressed, I'm feeling triggered. I remember having a conversation with my daughter who was freaking out about not being able to choose a topic to write her paper. She has dyslexia, anxiety, ADHD, and it wasn't the actual writing, it was choosing the topic. It was taking days. And she was having a fit because she was at the 11th hour. And I sat down on the stairs and got her to sit next to me, and I looked at her and I just said, are you aware that you're really stressed out right now? And like just stopping her and getting her to go, yeah, I'm stressed, was the first step in helping her then go through the rest of this process. But if you don't recognize it, you skip over that, you really can't take yourself through the rest of the process. Anything else, Di?
Part of this is about knowing what your triggers are, and part of this is about noticing it in your body. It's this sort of, everybody has a different way that stress shows up. It might be that you run your fingers through your hair. It might be that you clench your fists. It may be that your heart starts to palpitate. It may be that you stand up and sit up a little bit more straight. But it's about noticing in your body that something's different, something's going on. Oh, wait, I'm a little stressed out here, or I'm a lot stressed out here.
And there are a couple ways you can recognize it. I mean, the goal is to recognize it in the moment, but you can begin to train yourself to be able to do that by keeping a trigger journal, and noticing for a few days when you tend to get upset and what was happening right before that. And the other thing I like to talk about is noticing your tells, right? Like if you ever play cards, and I say this because I don't play cards, really, like certainly don't play poker, but the tell is like the thing that gives you away. So what's your body's tell that tells you that I'm starting to get upset, I'm starting to get triggered, and really paying attention to that.
My family goes, Mom, you're giving us the face. What's going on?
Yeah, it's a big tell, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so step one is to recognize that you're getting triggered in the first place. Huge. And to begin to teach, and just so I want to say, you can teach this to most of your kids and help them begin to learn this process too, right? So sometimes it's helping you recognize when you're triggered, sometimes it's helping them recognize when they're triggered.
So the second step is what we call reclaiming the brain. And this is about literally getting from the amygdala back into the frontal lobe so that you can take action in a different way. Because if you're in your amygdala, again, it's a sort of, your choices are fight, flight, freeze. And that's very reactive. A lot of times if we're fighting, we're literally raising our voice, or our kids are yelling at us. I mean, all these things are happening. So there's different ways to do this. Taking a deep breath, mindfulness, taking a sip of water is a great tool, but you really want to just go, okay, wait a second. I really need to calm down first. And this is really important, particularly with kids. If you've got a kid who's triggered, taking the time when you're trying to, your child's upset because you've asked them to do their homework and they want to do everything other than doing their homework. If you sit there and apply logic and you're telling them why they have to do their homework and you're trying to get them to do their homework, and all
why it's good for them.
And
right?
Yeah, it's good for them. And they're triggered. They can't hear your logic. They don't understand their logic. They just see, this is, Mom's in my way. Dad is in my way, and Dad is a threat to me. And I'm going to either run away or I'm going to fight with my parent, and that's a piece of it. So helping them reclaim their brain, unravel from the trigger, take those deep breaths, and really, really, really reclaim your brain. So we talk about the difference between fake calm and real calm. What you're really trying to do is to get to real calm. And I have parents tell me this all the time. I was talking to a mom the other day and she was like, okay, I spent about 10 minutes with my son, helping him to calm down. And then I started talking about his homework again. And he still didn't care. He still was like yelling back at me. And I'm like, that's probably a good indication that he wasn't really
calm. Yeah, fake calm is, they can throw fake calm like nobody's business. And I'm smiling because I remember when we first started working together, Dianne used to have all of her private clients walking around with bottles of water with sippy tops. Remember?
Yeah.
And that's because, as she taught me, I'll see if I get this right, that when you are drinking water, it sends a message to the brain that you're safe, as if you were an animal drinking at the watering hole. So remember, we're trying to get out of our primitive brain here. And so drinking water, not tea and coffee, sadly, but water will send the message to your brain that you're safe. And if you have water with, like one of the sports bottles where you have to kind of work to get the water out, that's an even better way to self-regulate the body. So finding the things that help you reclaim your brain. With my kids, we used to keep a chin-up bar in the kitchen, actually still have it. And when they'd get upset, they would just go, do some pull-ups or that kind of thing, or wall push-ups, or anything to physiologically shift, to change the energy from whatever you're focusing on to something usually sensory, something usually in the body that you can pay attention to command your brain to go someplace else. That's why Dianne mentioned mindfulness exercises can be really helpful.
Well, and one of the things I can just hear parents asking this question in the background, it's like, well, my kid doesn't, if I tell my kid, go calm down, it'll trigger them even more, right? And
True.
So the trick is to say, you know what, it feels like I'm getting a little off balance here. I'm going to go take a quick break and get some water. Do you want some? And then we can finish this conversation. So it's this sort of, you're doing it in a way that's not about, you're triggered right now, we can't talk, you've got to go calm down. You want to keep the judgment out of it, or chances are you're going to end up with even more drama and trigger.
Well, what I love about that is no one in the world has ever calmed down by somebody telling them to calm down, right?
It's true.
I mean, it just doesn't work that way. But if you, the other piece is if you have the conversation outside of the threat cycle, right? When you have this conversation when people are sort of in a normal place, then you can set the expectation that when they get upset or triggered, or when you get upset or triggered, we're going to recognize that, we're going to pause, we're going to reclaim the brain before we do anything else. So when you have kind of an agreement around that, it makes it a lot easier to slow down the process. And very often, we're the ones trying to rush it. Remember the days when we were trying to get out the door. Maybe it's we want to get out the door, or maybe it's we want to get the dishwasher unloaded so we can start dinner, or whatever it is. Often we're pushing it through at the very time we need to be pressing the pause button and slowing things down.
So once you've reclaimed your brain, the third step is to choose a new perspective. So there's two parts of this. One is really understanding the thought that you had that's causing your stress in the first place. So it might be, oh my gosh, I can never get this done, or I can't believe this, my child is yelling at me, this isn't okay. Or your child might be, Mom, why, mom's always on my back. Why, why is that happening?
Or how many times do I have to say, or why can't he just, or right?
Yeah. Somebody was talking about earlier about the plate, and if I have to say, take your plates to the sink one more time, I'll unplug. So that thought that I shouldn't have to say this, that's the thought in your head, right? So if you understand that that's what that thought is what's causing you stress, you can say, isn't something different? You want to choose a new perspective, a different thought that feels a little bit better. We don't have to jump to Pollyanna, but if you say, isn't it interesting that I've had to say this 10 times? I wonder what's going on that's making it hard for them to figure out how to take their plates to the sink. Feels a lot better than, why do I always have to say this 17 times?
Mm-hmm. So what I like to say here is, choose a new perspective. Another way of saying it is, we're going to make up a story. Dianne just gave you a whole bunch of stories that we make up about why things aren't going the way we want them. If you're going to make up a story anyway, why not make up a story that works for you? Why not make up a story that you can believe is true, that will support the whole family or dynamic in moving forward? Why not decide, wow, he's really having a hard time being respectful. She really doesn't remember to clear her plate. Whatever it is, I can help her with that. Or I wonder what system we can put in place as a reminder, or there's all kinds of ways to get curious once we choose a story that works for us and works for them, instead of telling ourselves a story that makes us feel bad.
The place to look for the stories that feel bad are where the shoulds live.
Yeah.
It's sort of, my kids should be able to do this, or this shouldn't be happening, or this, there's all of those shoulds in there that cause stress.
Well, we end up shoulding all over ourselves, right? So if we can take the should out of it and just be really clear with, here's where we are, where do we want to go, what's it going to take to get there, we can take a lot of that judgment out of it. So make up a story that works for you.
Yeah, so once you've created that new story, once you've chosen that perspective that feels a little bit better, then you can take new action. If I'm standing there in front of a kid who's talking in a rude tone, and that's one of my triggers, right? It's this sort of, if you can't call me that, it's not appropriate, I'm the mom, how dare you? I mean, all of these things start running through your head. If I can go to, wow, isn't it really interesting? I have a kid who's having a hard time showing respect right now. I wonder what's going on for them. Then I can go to, how can I help them, instead of, this has to stop. Because when I was triggered, it's like, this has to stop. I'm in fight or flight mode, or I got to get out of here. This isn't working. You want to be able to choose a different action besides fight or flight. And so the new thought helps you to do that.
Well, and what's fascinating, and this is what I think I fell in love with when I discovered coaching, is that the truth is the way the brain works. When we choose a new perspective, we actually open up different possibilities than existed before. So here's what I mean by that. You know that quote, if you believe you can or you can't, you're right. So if I believe I can't, that story of the guy who, the whole world didn't believe anybody could break the 4-minute mile because the sense was that they would drop dead. And when Roger Bannister, I think his name, actually broke the barrier and broke the 4-minute mile. He didn't collapse dead, he collapsed, but then it turned out he was alive, and it was miraculous, and everybody now believed that you could break the 4-minute mile. And while up until that point, nobody ever had, after that point, I think it was 300 people in the next year had broken the 4-minute mile. So when you change your perspective about what's possible, you actually open up different possibilities and different actions that you can take from there. And that's really what this is about.
Cool.
Anything you'd add, or should we move on? So those are your 4 steps to escape the stress cycle. We have one more little strategy.
So let me just go. So Elaine, just go back one second.
Okay.
Because you're talking about the difference between the stress cycle and the trigger cycle. This works for stressors as well as triggers. So if I'm just feeling overwhelmed and I can recognize that, I can reclaim my brain. I can go, okay, I'm willing to consider that even though there's a lot of things going on in my life right now, even though I'm in a stressful situation, I'm willing to consider that everything's going to be okay. Again, new perspective, new action. So it doesn't matter if you're triggered and angry and yelling or running away, or whether you're just overwhelmed and stressed. It works in both situations.
Well, and I was thinking about just one more thing. When you think about the world we're in right now, okay, we're recording this during the time of a global pandemic, 2020. I mean, all we're going to have to say in the future is 2020, and everybody will know what we mean, right? So none of us could have ever anticipated the nature of the threats we're facing, the extent of them, the multitude of them. And we can't always guarantee that everything's going to be okay. But what we can choose as a perspective is that we're going to be able to handle whatever comes our way, to trust that we can handle this, we can do this. One of the things I know about parents who are raising complex kids is that we've already had a lot of experience in learning how to navigate it when things don't go our way. We've already had a lot of obstacles that are thrown into our way that we've had to learn how to get around and jump over and move through. And so when we're looking at all of these things that are happening in the world, we may have that tendency to say, we can't handle this, we have no control over this. And it's true that there are some things we may not have control over, but we always have control over how we respond to what's happening. We can always be in command of our perspectives and our response. And that's kind of the magic in the world that we're in right now, with our kids, without our kids, is to be able to trust in our capacity to dance with whatever comes our way.
So there's a few things that you can look at to just kind of decrease the stress in the first place. So part of this is kind of what happens when stressful things happen or triggering things happen. And then the second piece of it is to really look at those places where stress can be produced, particularly if you've got a complex kid.
Well, and I just want to say so when we first started working together, one of the very first programs we ever created was something called Minimize Meltdowns. And this strategy comes out of Minimize Meltdowns, because when we look at reducing emotional intensity, as Dianne was saying earlier, sometimes we're trying to stop it, and sometimes we need to let it go and run its course. And so this was a strategy that we pulled to help begin to minimize the kinds of emotional upsets that tend to happen in families.
So the acronym is TACT, T-A-C-T, triggers, avoidance, consistency, and transitions. So we've already kind of talked about triggers, and it's about knowing what your triggers are, knowing what your child's triggers are. What are those things that kind of throw you off balance, either into a place of avoidance, a place of frustration, whatever it is. But so that's the first piece, is to understand and know what your triggers are.
And then we kind of mentioned avoidance by talking about a trigger journal, right? Once you know what your triggers are, you can anticipate them. You can begin to avoid putting yourself in situations where you know people are going to get triggered. I mean, it's really that simple. If you know that getting out the door in the morning in the old days was a really heavy stress time, you might need an extra 10, 15 minutes. You might have a different parent that takes the lead on that. There are all kinds of things you might do differently when you know that it's the rushing that causes the stress for one particular child, or it's the constant reminders. Whatever it is, you can begin to shift how you're doing it. My family, we discovered that mornings, we shifted mornings completely, but one of the shifts was we realized what we thought was helpful reminders, they were taking as criticism. And so when we had a family meeting and talked about it, we stopped doing reminders, and instead at a particular time every morning, I think it was like 6:52 or whatever it was, Dad came out to the hallway and gave the weather report for the day. The kids got the weather. We weren't saying, get your stuff done. And they all knew that they knew exactly what time it was when he did the weather report. So it was a way of avoiding a lot of the upsets that were happening by not doing the things that were annoying them, because they get annoyed too. Yeah. They're human, right?
The third thing is about consistency, and this is often a hard thing, especially if you're overwhelmed or you've got anxiety yourself. Kind of being in that space where you can bring some consistency to the situation can decrease stress for your kids. Sometimes they really like the structure and the predictability, and it makes it easier for them and for you to avoid some stress.
And I want to say that for some of you like me, I think consistency is a 4-letter word. So, you do it to the best that you can, and you're not always going to be 100%. You're not going to be bulletproof. You're not going to be totally consistent, and that's okay too. The idea is to create an environment where there's some basic expectations that we all share. But if you're not perfect, that's okay.
And then the last one is transitions, and this is a big one. There's so many components. We teach this so much in all of our programs, Insanity School and Parent Success System. But the reality is that for complex kids particularly, or if you're a complex adult, those transitions from they're watching a TV show or they're on their iPad and it's time to go to bed. They're playing a game on the internet and they need to start on their homework. They're sleeping and they need to wake up. Those are places to really look at triggers and stress happening in those transitions, and really taking some time to look at the process you're using to help your child manage through the transition. If you're noticing that your child gets always inflamed when it's time, you tell them it's time for bed, or it's time for dinner, or it's time for whatever else, chances are there's an opportunity there to really look at the process you're using and making it easier for them and their brain particularly to transition from what they are doing to what you want them to be doing or whatever's next.
So, the example that's coming up for me was just a little while ago. I was in my kitchen before this event, and my daughter is home. She's graduated from college and she's studying for a standardized test. And she was talking about a strategy. She was sharing with me a strategy she had created to manage the transition from studying from one subject to another, because she's got to do all this stuff and she's got to shift, and she can get overwhelmed by it. So she actually downloaded a new app on her phone that's like a flashcards kind of thing, because she thought it would be fun. And so she actually created a transition for herself so that she didn't get distracted by using her phone. She gave herself something to do on her phone that was productive instead of distracting. And so ultimately that's where, we want to get our kids to the point where they're doing this on their own. But it starts by us raising the awareness to transitions with them and helping them begin to see that the transition is hard and what might help ease the transition for them.
So Stacy asked us to give some suggestions around transitions, Elaine, and there's so many of them, Stacy, on our website on ImpactADHD.com, but the one that kind of comes up for me more than anything else is really understanding what process are they in as a way to understand what they need to switch. So think about it. How many times do you go in and you say, it's time for dinner, and we expect them to be able to just switch gears and change and be ready for dinner. And it may be that even a half an hour ago, you came in and said dinner in a half an hour. But if your kid's like most kids, their time awareness is not, 30 minutes passes and it might as well have been last week, right? Because they just don't have the executive function capabilities to think about, well, is it 29 minutes? Is it 28 minutes? All of that sort of thing with time awareness. So really thinking about what does your child most effectively need to transition from one thing to another. It may be several reminders. It may be, so for example, if your child's watching a video game and you come in, or watching a video and you come in and say, time to stop, maybe it's a pause to say, how many minutes are left in your video? Well, it's 30 minutes left. Well, let's hit pause, and I promise that we can, we can figure out how to make sure you can watch the end of this after dinner. Or, if it's 8 minutes, kind of saying, well, then let's go ahead and finish it now. But it's that sort of understanding what the transition process might logically be for the child to help honor that.
So what the example that's coming up to me, there are a couple. One is there's one of my favorite coaches, this guy named Rudy Rodriguez in North Carolina. And he's a social worker and a coach, and he talks about the notion of getting ready to get ready to go, right? I'm fixing to get ready to whatever. So to think in terms of transitions, in terms of you create, it's like there's a space before the change that happens that we need to make awareness of. And that's kind of what Diane's talking about in terms of how much time do you need. You know, understanding that when kids are getting off a video game these days, it's usually not a toggle button that you're going to turn off. There could be a 10, 15, 20-minute process that's required for them to get off a game so that they don't lose whatever it is that they were just doing. If we dismiss that and say, well, I don't care, you got to get off the game, we're not really acknowledging and honoring what they're doing, and it's important to them. But if we can sort of work with them and say, okay, how much time do you need? What does it really take? Not only are you raising their awareness, but you're really honoring and showing them some respect. Again, it's about bringing them into the process of problem solving instead of just trying to fix it for them. And everything we are talking about is about changing our way of communicating with our kids to a style that's more collaborative, so that they see what's going on with themselves without judgment and begin to learn how to put systems and structures and processes in place to manage themselves.
So a couple things that are coming up. One is, you know, when to have these conversations. You don't want to do this in the middle of them trying to get off a video game, because they're going to be hyper-focused and they're not going to be able to focus with you. And they're going to say one more minute, one more minute, one more minute. And
right.
You'll sound like a broken record. So, and another tip, we used to have a rule in our house that, you know, just a second was never an appropriate answer. It was kind of like, okay, wait. So I know it's not just a second. Take a deep breath and tell me how long you really think it's going to take. You know,
we have a joke because we have an aunt that's perpetually really, really late. So when I say just a minute, David will say, "Is that an Aunt Beth minute?" Right? Or is that a real minute? And it's a joke, but it's a way for me to be realistic and to sort of have that communication with them in a way that's less defensive. And I think humor is a great piece to talk about here too, is that, you know, we tend to get stressed out. Things have to be done in a certain way and at a certain time. And if we've learned anything this year, it's that we could be a little more chill on some of that, you know, urgency. And humor is a great way to lighten the conversations, not take ourselves too seriously, not take, you know, if you're worried that your 14-year-old isn't going to be ready for whatever by college, well, they're still only 14. They're not supposed to be ready yet, and that's okay, right? So give ourselves permission to lighten up a little bit.
May not feel like it, but you've got lots of time. Even if you're junior in college or high school, getting ready for college, you've got time.
Yes. They're not gone at 18, I promise. And if we've learned nothing else this year, they're not gone at 18.
Yeah.
Right.
So all of this is wrapped into something we call the coach approach to parenting. And we talked early on about the fact that our approach is designed for parents of complex kids, but it works for parents of kids in any kind of situation, any age. But it's really about help, not just getting the stuff done, getting the homework done, getting the things of life done, but also about helping your child to become increasingly more independent and to help them to become problem solvers themselves. And
to stay in relationship with them while you're doing it, right? Like we often say to parents, if you don't know, we have in the model that we teach, and I think that's probably the next slide. Yep. So we teach a model on how do you tackle any kind of challenging situation, and you can use it for handling transitions or for schoolwork or for home chores or whatever it is. But the thing about it is it starts with taking aim, and we always say to parents, if you don't know where to take aim, there are two places to start. If you really don't know what else to focus on, always start with either self-care for you or leaning into your relationship with your kid, because at the end of the day, those are the two pieces that will set the stage for long-term success in terms of collaboration with your kid, in terms of fostering independence. If you take care of you, you're going to be less stressed, more chilled, and more able to be present to them in that relationship, which is going to build more trust and build more openness so that your kids can collaborate with you and learn to manage themselves, which is the ultimate goal.
Trust, relationship, collaboration, problem solving, independence.
Right. And so this is the model that we teach in the programs. John mentioned Sanity School earlier. We teach it in Sanity School. This is the model we go through in the new book, The Essential Guide to Raising Complex Kids with ADHD, Anxiety, and More. It's a mouthful of a title. And as you learn it, what we're learning is you can use it to help your kids manage, and you can use it to manage your own issues as well. And we want to invite you.
Yeah,
Yes?
so we have an event this week, if you're listening to this before August 27th. Back to School Survival webinar. It's an hour-long webinar we're doing for free on Thursday. You can sign up at backtoschoolsurvival.com. If you're listening to this after Thursday, go ahead and go to backtoschoolsurvival.com. You can still register to get the replay, and we hope you'll join us and get even some more tips on some of the struggles we're having right now. It's the pandemic edition. We do this every year, but it's a little bit of a nuance because everybody's in different stages of online or at school or not at school, or challenges are just completely different this year, aren't they?
Yeah, and as we said earlier, and you can handle it, whatever comes your way. So Sanity School is the program John mentioned and that we were telling about. We have Sanity School for parents and for teachers. And I think that is it. I thought there was a picture of the book in here, but there's not. So
We do have a question. How can we raise awareness of these teacher schools when they are non-cooperative?
How do we raise awareness of what?
The teachers or the schools when they're not cooperative, when they don't get it. And I think that that's the piece of it. First of all, I think is this concept that as a parent, you really do have to be an educator and an advocate. There's a great video on our website about what to expect from teachers. But our teachers are not always educated to understand complex kids. They don't understand if it's a kid with ADHD or anxiety or whatever else. They may not even quite get it. They may have misinformation. And so it really is part of our job as a parent to find gentle ways to educate. I remember one of our coaches talking to Elaine about always show up to those meetings at school with
brownies.
With cookies, or bring the cookies, not the lawyer, is kind of what she used to say. It's this sort of, you really want to go in gently and be respectful of the fact and lead with compassion. These teachers, especially this year, are dealing with some really complicated sorts of things for themselves and their own families. So start with compassion, start with cookies, know that it's your job to advocate and educate. What would you add, Elaine?
Well, I think that what you're saying is on target, right? Like teachers are not necessarily as well educated as we'd like them to be, or as well educated as we are, and that's not their fault, right? It's not that they don't want to understand. They've never had an opportunity. We've been teaching Sanity School for teachers for about 4 years, and I can't tell you the number of teachers I've had who've gotten on an office hours call with us in tears and said, I feel so bad. I had no idea. I didn't know. I didn't understand. And so taking the time and the space to gently help them understand and not get angry when they don't. The other thing is that we have a tendency in the world of treatment, in that kind of medical model, to go for solutions. We go for the fix, right? We're going to put them on medication. We're going to give them a star chart. We're going to go for solution. And part of what happens is if the teacher doesn't understand what's going on with a child in terms of executive function challenges, they know they've got a solution, but they don't understand why that solution would work for that child. So they don't know how to apply it in a way that might really empower that child. So sometimes it's about taking the solutions that you've got in your IEPs and 504s and really massaging the conversation with the teacher to make sure they understand why it will work and what is it about it that will be successful for this child or what may not be. I remember having a conversation with a teacher once, just teaching the teacher that my son did really much better if she would start by acknowledging what he had done on his checklist before she got to what he hadn't done. And she was just a checklist teacher. She was a great teacher, but she was one of those teachers who's like, well, great, you didn't do this, this, this. And all he needed was to hear, great job doing this and that, before he heard you didn't do this, because it shut him down. And it was a really simple tweak. So ask for what you want instead of only focusing on what's not going well.
Well, the other thing that I'm sorry, John, that I would say is that there's an aspect of trust in this too, because even if you are great at sharing and advocating and everything else, there are going to be years in your child's life that they may have a teacher that just doesn't quite get them. And I think that it's about trusting that one year, knowing when it really is a difficult enough situation that you need to come up with another choice for your child from an education perspective, but then also trusting that, sometimes your kids get stretched when they're in a classroom with a teacher that doesn't get them. I think my son's best year might've been 4th grade when his teacher just totally didn't get it, but it really pushed him to be in a very different place than the teacher in 5th grade who really understood and was handling him very differently from supporting his executive function challenges, those sorts of things. So there's a little element of trust in there as well. John, what were you going to say?
My wife is a teacher, and as such, we've always been very sensitive to that issue, and we're all recognizing that our kids require more from their teachers than other kids in the classroom. And so there are some inexpensive ways that you can support, which is asking a very simple question of the teacher. What can I do at home to support what you're trying to accomplish with my kid? Yeah. And if they feel like you're on the same page and that you're part of the solution rather than creating an adversarial relationship, that goes a long way. Another thing that we have done is, we recognize, and early on, what do teachers need? And then trying to meet those needs so that on some level, they feel like we're in this to help them. So they then want to turn around and be in it to help us. And I'm not going to call those bribes, but we certainly never miss an opportunity to go the extra mile. Whether it was putting in a fund to help teachers pay for school supplies, to putting another computer into the classroom. And maybe one of the most successful things we ever did was, and again, I recognize we've gone from free to now things costing a little more money, but teachers need CEU credits. And one of the things that I like doing is, or have done for teachers, is do pay for their conference workshop that they're going to attend and cover the cost of the sub, so that they could then learn the thing that I want them to know, I want them to learn. And with so many conferences going virtual now, that's so much easier. But remember that all teachers have to maintain and work on CEU credits, and that's an opportunity to help educate them in remarkable ways.
Well, and John, thank you for saying that. We've had a couple of parents that have actually paid for their child's teacher to take Sanity School for Teachers, and it's a great gift and a great example. And we're not the only ones, but thank you for saying that.
Of course, of course.
I think what you're pointing to is the notion of if we see it as a team. You treat your team members with respect, you trust your team members, right? You lean into your team members. And if we see it as a team and invite them to see us as working with them, it takes away a lot of the defensiveness.
You know what else it takes away? Stress. It's less stressful to feel like you're in a collaborative relationship than an adversarial one.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah.
It's funny. I think back to my eldest kid, who was particularly complicated. I had a great relationship with most of those teachers over the years, and even though they would tell you that was one of their more difficult child, they also loved that kid. And I think I hear this from parents a lot, that our kids, they may be quirky and difficult, and often they're so unbelievably wonderfully lovable. And I know that not everybody feels that way at this moment. I get that. But if we can help the teachers see what's lovable about them and connect to that and feel like we're working together, it really does a lot to reduce stress for everybody. Yeah.
Well, and it's a great perspective shift, right? So going back to this conversation we had earlier about stress, right? It's this sort of, if you're having a hard time because your kid is making you absolutely crazy, taking a minute and writing down all the things you love about your child just for a second can be a great way to reframe and get back into the place where you can problem solve and say, okay, my kid's having a hard time. How do I help them? Instead of just being ready to bang their heads together or whatever it is.
Yeah. We have a strength exercise in Homework Headaches that sort of walks parents through, how do you do that? How do you see the gift in the challenge?
And isn't that funny? Because that was the title of my webinar last week.
Awesome.
Folks, as such, and certainly one of the things that I love so much about Elaine and Dianne is that we are very strength focused. We are, let's take what's right about our families, our kids, and expand that and find ways to nurture those gifts. This webinar will be up online, and with Dianne and Elaine's permission, we'll put the PowerPoint up as well. And so you can go back, you can listen to it, you can share it with friends. But I want to thank Dianne and Elaine so much. You never disappoint, and boy, did I need to hear some of the things that you had to say today. So appreciate you all. Thank you so very much. We appreciate those of you that attended. And please go to Impact ADHD website. Make sure that you pick up Elaine's new book. I can't wait to read it. It arrived in the mail yesterday. And as always, if we can find a way to support you, we certainly want to do so. Thanks again.
Thanks for having us, John, very much.
Oh, truly my pleasure.